Chapter 10 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 10. The Top of the Tide. The Indians, after brief confusion under Timothy Tripp's gunfire, now rallied boldly and came swarming down upon the Jocasta herself, where she swung at anchor in the river halfway between shore and shore. The crew of the longboat had come over the side, the wounded had been got aboard, and the captain carried to his cabin. The arrow had pierced his neck, and he was unconscious from loss of blood. But under Michael's first hasty examination and dressing, he seemed not to be mortally wounded. The hurts of the two seamen were more serious. Timothy Tripp, chief gunner's mate and expert marksman, was in command of the smoking guns, and was loading and firing industriously. He and his comrades were still sending forth a steady succession of round cannon shot, and had sunk half a dozen of the light Indian craft, so that the remainder hung in the wind just beyond reach, furious and afraid. Michael, stopping for a moment beside Tripp, praised his uncannily successful aim, which, in spite of the pitching deck, never seemed to miss. The canoes would advance, then draw off again, and hover and dip, out of range, but ready for another onslaught. "I shall not be satisfied until I have sunk that especial one that my own hands helped to build," snarled Tripp, ramming home a charge and swinging his piece for a new aim. "I have not yet seen that happy bridegroom that I helped to his bride, the more fool I. Trust me to know him again. I am going to send him to the bottom if it is the last shot I ever fire." A deluge of rain now came down, and under its cover the red warriors seemed to gather for renewed attack, but their losses had weakened their courage as well as their numbers. A handful of canoes did indeed win close to the ship. One came so close that the guns could not reach it, and a single brave came clambering up to thrust his painted countenance streaming with rain over the side, almost directly in Michael's face. The boy caught him and shook him, huge warrior as he was, as though he had been a dead sea otter, then flung him outward to carry down in his headlong fall the fellow who was scrambling up behind him. A very cloudburst of rain came pouring down immediately, stunning and blinding both assailed and assailants. When its fury had eased a little and it was possible to see again, the whole company of Indians was gone. For 2 days the Jocasta lay in as empty a land as though its red inhabitants had vanished into non-existence. No one attempted to go ashore. No canoe appeared upon the quiet water. The storm had blown itself out quickly, and the water of their landlocked refuge was glassy quiet. Captain Douglas had regained consciousness. One of the wounded seamen was able to limp about the deck. The other lay in the forecastle struggling against death. On the 3rd day there was a stir upon the wooded shore. A canoe with 2 warriors came skimming over to them. The men held their hands aloft and shouted "Lally," the term which those on the Jocasta had come to understand as meaning friend. They were suffered to come aboard and marched down to the trade room, where Michael received them, though with a loaded pistol laid openly on the table. It was the chief Wakananish who drew forth a bundle and laid it upon the table, a thick, soft roll of otter pelts. With unchanging expression, Michael opened his store of wampum, measured out the amount of the original price, and poured it upon the table. "Quan come," he said grimly, having heard those words for no more, repeated beyond any possibility of forgetting. The Indian pondered, grunted, and pushed the furs toward him, gathering up the shell. Trading had begun again. Negotiations had been renewed, but on an ominously different basis. "Do you notice they bring us no more meat or wappatu?" Charles Brigham asked Michael, who nodded uneasily. "We must go ashore to hunt again before long," he said. When he and Timothy Tripp landed a few days later with their rifles in their hands, they were received by a hail of arrows, coming from so many quarters at once that it was impossible to do other than retreat to the waiting boat. 2 or 3 other attempts came to the same end. "We might land enough armed men to drive the lurking ruffians back," Michael declared, "but what sort of hunting could we do after fighting a gun battle first?" Several sallies were made to procure water, but only in openly warlike array with shooting and casualties on both sides. Yet the Indians continued to come out to the ship with furs, evidently feverishly anxious for trade. Since here the wishes of the whites agreed with theirs, the armed truce and the brisk exchange went on. The red tribes had all possessed plenty of skins hoarded away somewhere, brought out now in astonishing abundance. They never haggled now over the price, but accepted the appointed amount day after day. Slowly the store of furs in the hold approached the desired number. Slowly the supply of shells, beads, tobacco, and woolen cloth diminished. Fresh meat ran very low, and it was becoming increasingly hazardous to go for water. "I cannot see what is the object of their game," said Charles Brigham for the 100th time. "It seems that they are watching for us to starve, and our ship to rot here in the river, as though they were a flock of waiting buzzards." Michael had been giving the matter his deepest thought, and now finally produced the opinion which he had reached. "They are mad for wampum. You could see that in their eyes from the first minute. Even Indians cannot conceal everything, and now that they realize that we are trapped here behind the bar, they believe that we must stay here forever and fall into their hands at last. Yet they cannot endure to wait for the shell. They will get what they can of it now by trading, and presently, when our numbers are lessened and our supplies and ammunition gone, they will storm our ship again and lay hands on everything they desire. And," he ended bitterly, "their plan may not be so far amiss. The Jocasta is a well-found ship, but we cannot live here upon her for unmeasured time." "Is she to lie and drop to pieces in this cursed river?" exclaimed Charles Brigham. "We will never abide that. We can land our guns and arms and cut our way overland to the Columbia." "The Columbia may well have sailed by now," Michael replied gravely. "We cannot go blundering and seeking her all up and down the coast, with these fiends picking us off from every bush. And would you abandon the Jocasta to them?" "No," cried Charles Brigham, and Michael smiled. "Nor would I," he agreed. It began to seem as though the cunning of the savages was to win in the desperate contest of wills. More and more men were wounded in the periodic battles over filling the water casks. Provisions were still very plentiful, but if they could win free, there was still the long voyage across the Pacific to be faced. The captain was recovering, but the first man hurt had died. Another was like to do so. 3 would be crippled for many weeks to come. The prospect of destruction seemed to be creeping closer and closer. Captain Douglas, once on his feet again, took wise and vigorous command of the situation. "The first necessity is to see whether the vessel's keel was injured on the bar," he declared. "And after our voyage through tropic waters, the hull should be looked to in any case." They found a properly sloping sandbank and careened the ship. They had dismounted the guns and placed them in commanding position to defend themselves, and the Jocasta again renewed attack. There were 1 or 2 skirmishes, but the Indians seemed to have had their full of cannon fire and preferred to wait rather than to make open assault. It was discovered that the ship showed little trace of that hideous moment of scraping on the bar. That Ephraim Havergal's great oak timbers had stood bravely under the terrific strain. The copper sheathing had been started here and there, but this was readily set right, and the hull scraped clean. Then, with the help of current and tide, she was presently got afloat again. Anxious councils were held in the cabin as to what was to be done next, what measures could be taken to set the vessel free. One quarter had not been thoroughly explored by sounding a certain channel between a small island and the shore. From the way the tide sets in thither at the very flood, there should perhaps be better water than we had thought, Charles Brigham said. When a boat was sent to discover the depth and the current of that narrow crooked way, it was met by a furious attack from the Indians in force. Even when the next attempt was made in the longboat, with armed men ranged along the gunwale to protect the sailor who hove the lead, the result was only a desperate battle fought between bank and boat, with Indians shooting from under cover and at deadly short range. The party came back to the ship without having accomplished its purpose. If another trial must be made, the Jocasta must lie inshore to protect them with her guns. It seemed from the ferocity of the attacks that there might be a chance of escape through the watery byway, but without full knowledge it would be madness to make the attempt. To come aground in that narrow space would be to lose the ship, Captain Douglas declared, nor could anyone gainsay him. After this final struggle, even the semblance of truce came to an end. Canoes paddling alongside were ordered away, and a cannon shot emphasized the command. There were enough furs in the hold now to warrant their taking passage for China at last if they could. There was very little left of the riches which the Indians coveted, but even that little the red men were fiercely determined not to lose by letting their prize escape. No warrior offered to approach the ship again. Instead, as the crew of the Jocasta noted, watchfires burned that night on both banks of the river, and in the daylight a patrol of canoes was continually paddling back and forth upon the bar. Each time that the Jocasta even swung about at her moorings with the tide, there was a cloud of watchers, no longer even troubling to conceal themselves, keeping warily beyond the limit of gunshot, never absent, and apparently never sleeping. Captain Gray had said that Indian activities were seldom great at night, since with their superstitious terror of the spirits of forest and water, the red men were afraid of the dark. The warriors of Wakananish, however, fortified their courage by building huge blazes and by watching in great companies, for on this occasion desire was greater than terror. Sometimes in the stillness of the midnight watch on board the ship, there would come across the water a weird slow song, not the sound of a chorus, but of a single voice. "It is their medicine man," Michael divined at last. Timothy Tripp, who was on watch with him, hung over the rail to listen in the stillness. "It is belike our death song that he is singing," he observed. He grinned like some wrinkled-faced goblin in the light of the ship's lantern. "Let him chant until he is weary. There is a song my guns can sing, which will offer pleasant chorus to his single refrain." The weather had been wet and chilly, overcast by fogs rolling in from the sea. There was now, however, a brief respite, a day with warm sunshine and, when evening came, with stars in the eastern sky, although heavy clouds were piled high in the west. Captain Douglas and Charles Brigham were in some discussion below, the murmur of their anxious voices coming up the companionway. Michael and Timothy Tripp were once more together, standing the dog watch at the hour when faint twilight finally turns to night. "Is it fog coming in, sir, or why do we not see that watchfire burning on the point?" Timothy Tripp had been aloft, and, even from the cross-trees, had failed to catch a glimpse of that beacon which, for the last 3 nights, ever since the fight below the island, had seemed to overlook every movement of the ship with its unwinking red eye. "I do not even hear the medicine man's song," Michael said. "I had thought that perhaps the wind, coming straight downstream, might have failed to carry it to us. There was, indeed, such a hush over everything as they had not noted for some time. Their ears were trained by that period of watching and listening to distinguish the different sounds of the forest, and they could be certain that such soft, steady rustling as they could hear was only the noise of the wind in the trees, and that there was no stirring or movement now, where formerly their enemies had moved to and fro so freely. One might almost think that they had all stolen clean away, Timothy Tripp remarked. But we know well that they will hang here just beyond our reach until the very end, whatever that end is to be. Michael leaned forward, listening intently. Yet I hear something at last, he declared softly. It almost sounds like dipping paddles that are coming close. Both of them stood motionless to hearken. It was true indeed that the sound was approaching, the regular soft splash of a steadily wielded blade. The lookout forward came aft to report. "A canoe on the weather bow, sir. Shall we slew around the forward gun?" "Wait until it comes closer," ordered Michael, "but tell the men to stand by with muskets ready." It had grown so dark that the boat was only a vague blot, moving like a phantom across the water toward them. The tide was coming in and was running so rapidly up the river that the Indians had little more to do than to keep their craft headed in the direction of the ship as they drifted rapidly toward the Jocasta. A row of anxious faces leaned over the bulwarks to watch them approach. "They do not even make the pretense of calling out that they are friends," said Tripp. "Shall I fire?" "No," returned Michael quickly. "Wait. Do you see? There is a woman in the boat." The canoe had now come under the great shadow of the ship's side and was slipping aft to drop under her stern. Timothy Tripp took up a lantern and held it out beyond the rail so that the light fell downward upon two dark upturned faces. "Ah, ah," he cried, "I know who you are, the blackest traitor of them all." The man below stood up, balancing himself easily in the rocking cockle-shell, and spoke very clearly. "Hanno," he said, and repeated it, his own name again, "Hanno." With it he added at last the word for friend, Lally. It was he whom Timothy Tripp had helped to fashion his canoe. This woman in the stern, sitting absolutely motionless save for an occasional dip of the paddle to keep the boat in its place, was evidently the bride whom the little sailor had aided him to win. "Let me go down to him," roared the infuriated Tripp. "A musket ball is not enough. It is with a cutlass that I want to settle my account with the man who made such a fool of me." "Hush," commanded Michael. "Wait to see why they have come. Do you notice that they have no weapons in their hands?" The woman, slim and young, and managing the boat with the ease with which a waterfowl rides upon the ripples, looked up at him gratefully. She could understand not a word of what they were saying, but there was no mistaking the tone of Tripp's indignant fury, and of Michael's stern order to be quiet. The Indian brave was now going through a strange pantomime of which at first they could make nothing. He pointed first toward the little island beyond which ran that narrow channel which they had attempted to explore. Then he pointed to the eastward, to a white gleam of light behind the hills which showed where the moon was about to rise. Then he waved his hand toward that spot upon the far point where the watchfire had burned so long but was now quenched. What was he trying to tell them? Captain Douglas and Charles Brigham, hastily summoned, were also listening and watching beside the rail. The three looked at one another bewildered. No one could divine the meaning of what the Indian was trying to convey. The woman now joined her effort to his. She laid down her paddle and made rippling motions with her hands as though to denote water. She raised them higher and then, like her husband, swung about to point at the moonrise. Michael, clutching the edge of the rail with both hands, leaned over as far as he could to observe what she was about. "Do it again," he directed, and she, catching the meaning of his order, went through the curious dumb show once more. Suddenly he straightened up with his face lighting. "She means the tide," he cried to the others, "the high tide of the full moon. They are trying to tell us that perhaps the channel beyond the island is navigable with the water at its greatest height." He pointed to the island, and the two in the smaller boat cried out together in delight that he began to understand. The man even began to jabber excitedly, and once more waved both hands toward where the fire had been, trying to tell them something concerning the watchers on the shore. But the woman did not allow the issue to be confused. She still kept indicating first the island, then the white eastern sky. "It might be treachery once again," said Charles Brigham doubtfully. But Captain Douglas wasted no moments on hesitating wonder. "Up sail," he ordered. There was a confused hurry of running and scrambling feet. The blocks began to creak and groan as the halyards ran through them. The unfurling canvas rustled and slatted in the easy breeze as one sail after another spread to the breeze. The two Indians, dropping off a little, sat regarding the still ship springing suddenly into life. The quick slapping ripples which had been running along the Jocasta's side ceased suddenly, and she began slowly to swing round with the wind. The tide had reached its flood. The anchor came up with a rush. The ship went winging down the river, came sharply about, and began to nose her way out into the narrow channel. "Out with the boats," ordered Captain Douglas, and down dropped every boat into the water with every oar manned. There was left on board the slenderest crew that ever sailed a ship, only a single seaman beside the captain at the helm, with Timothy Tripp and another gunner at the bow, crouching ready to fire the instant a rustle in the undergrowth should give him a point at which to aim. There was still silence, utter, incomprehensible silence, as they moved slowly along. "They must be waiting to take us at the narrowest place," thought Michael, touching his rifle, which lay between his knees where he sat in the forward boat. But they reached and passed the spot where those on the ship might have stretched out a hand to touch the trees on either side, where the yards had to be swung to permit her to pass, and still they moved forward in the same uncanny quiet. The wind came near to failing them as they crept forward, yet it was true, as the Indian in all good faith had tried so hard to tell them. By some curious trick of rock and coastline, the flood of the highest tide and the force of its ebb set stronger through this constricted way than over the open bar. Every man pulled as though his heart would burst, dragging the ship slowly onward. Once she caught and grated, grazing the bottom ever so slightly, but with the heroic efforts of her crew sufficing to drag her free. "The moon's lifting her," panted the sailor next behind Michael. Above the tree-tops a great gold bubble was floating higher and higher. The sea was opening before them. There was a last heartbreaking second of scraping hesitation, and the Jocasta floated clear. Regardless of time or caution or weariness, a great cheer went up from the men resting exhausted at their oars. It echoed from the island and from the forested shores, but there came forth no answer from their still enemies. Only far away a black dot floated in the white moon path, a canoe containing two tiny figures dwindling out of sight as the Jocasta leaned to the wind and rose to the first of the long sea swells. Why? Why? Michael was still marveling over the strange miracle of peace which had let them go free undisturbed. It may have something to do with the moon, he kept thinking vaguely. He had seen, just as they slipped into the shadowy canal, that the girl had risen in the canoe and was holding up her hands, not toward them, but toward the moon, as though in prayer. A mystery the question must just then remain. The thought that they were clear again was sufficient to fill every heart. They dropped down the coast, keeping sharp lookout for the flying colors of the Columbia. They found her after several days of cruising, anchored some distance to the southward of where they had first discovered her. In her cabin, Captains Gray and Kendrick listened with grave faces to the account of the Jocasta's trading experience. I have heard that the northern bands of Indians are both fiercer and more sullen than those with which we have had to do," Captain Gray said when Michael had finished. "There came word from village to village that you had only touched upon the coast, and then stood westward across the big water. That Chief Wakananish is assuredly a crafty enemy." Their own trade had gone peaceably enough, but very slowly. The Indians with whom they had been dealing were less of a warlike nation, and one more willing to abide by reason in the process of barter and exchange. Captain Kendrick had begun to see that they would not have gathered a cargo before winter, and that his wisest course would be to spend the season upon the coast. Amongst the more friendly tribes of that region this was a safe but tedious prospect. "So you will clear before we will," Captain Gray said to Michael, "but there is no foreseeing what chances may speed or hinder us both. I will look to greet you, perhaps, in the roadstead of Whampoa. If not there, we will meet once more when we are all safe home again in New England." Any knowledge which the keen mind of Captain Gray had gathered was, as before, generously placed at the other's disposal. He had possessed some information concerning the China Sea and Whampoa, the anchorage where foreign ships must lie when they put into the port of Canton, concerning the Malacca Straits and the passage home, all of which he communicated freely to the officers of the Jocasta. When Michael told him of that strange silence on the night of their departure, he thought for a little before he said, "It seems to me that I have understood from these Indians who are our neighbors here, that the night of the full moon is a sacred time to them, and that they must not go forth, even against their deadliest enemy, between its rising and setting. That Hanno and his bride were bold indeed to venture against such a belief, and to come out to save you. Such a man as Wakananish, ignorant, suspicious, half a coward and half a crafty knave, would do nothing against the voice of the medicine man, and his decree of what the gods desired and forbade." Such of the trade goods as he still had left, Michael was glad to turn over to the Columbia and the Lady Washington, since the Jocasta was anxious to be gone. As he offered the red and blue cloth, he told Captain Gray that, although there was still a little of the wampum remaining, he had sometimes had an impulse to cast it into the sea. "People say that gold is an evil thing," he observed, "but it is not really the good clean metal which we must blame, but the greed which causes it to awaken the worst in men's hearts. These shells, which are nothing but children's toys, have the same evil spell upon them. I think," returned Captain Gray, "that no one could trade with those Indians of Wakananish's tribe without coming to bloodshed before the fair is ended. Indians are too well accustomed to take what they want by plunder to hold their desires within the bounds of trade. It may be that the trouble was brought on more quickly by the unwanted sight of too much wealth at once. Wealth, so it must have seemed to Wakananish's eyes, that was in the keeping of a handful of men who could not defend it against superior force. I felt that I had done wrong in letting him see the whole of it the moment I caught sight of the ravenous look in his eyes," Michael lamented bitterly. "What an unwise and costly error it proved to be! Why could I have not known better? Somebody of more worth than I should have had the matter in charge." "No man knows the best way in an undertaking never attempted before," Robert Gray comforted him. "It was not your lack of years and experience which was the cause of your misfortunes. It was the fact that no person has yet any real knowledge of these Indians' minds. You knew better what to do than did we, who brought them rattles and musical instruments. And now, profiting by your experience, we may hope to turn what is left of the wampum into furs without further mischance." On the morning that the Jocasta was ready to weigh anchor for her westward voyage, Captain Gray came aboard to bid them good-bye. His eye ran wistfully over the taut, tense beauty of the Jocasta. Both the Columbia and the Lady Washington were old ships, good vessels in their way, but not to compare with this. "Carry my compliments home to the man who built her," he said. "Let him take an old skipper's word for it that he has done more than well." All on the Jocasta were sorry indeed to see the last of this shrewd, intelligent, generous man who had been so freely willing to give them all possible aid. His last words remained long in Michael's mind. "In these days of changing conditions and new trade routes, there is no ship which ever sails an uneventful voyage. Never a cruise in which a ship is not the sport of wind and weather and 100 unforeseen chances besides. Pirates are still known in the West Indies. They swarm in the Mediterranean. Pirates, too, in their big square junks and their skimming lorchas, will be waiting for you off the coast of China. And there will be reefs and shoals, typhoons and savages on strange lands. May you have the good luck to win safely past them all. I cannot wish you a voyage without adventure. There is no such thing. But I trust that the most of your chances of the sea will be good rather than evil. May the adventures awaiting you all have happy endings. May you have more fair weather than foul. You will see both." Thus the goodbyes were said, and the Jocasta set sail. The Pacific is a vast ocean. As William Tuttle, the oldest sailor aboard, said to Michael during one of the lengthy talks which an under-officer and a member of the crew often have together when the long hours of the night watch are undisturbed, "We have it from Columbus that the world is round, but I think this half of it is further around than the other." The Jocasta, that infinitely tiny dot on the enormous expanse of blue water, sailed and sailed and sailed, and appeared still to be always at the center of the same unchanging circle of sea and sky. It seemed as though she had compassed a tremendous journey when she sighted a bold headland and passed round it into a smooth palm-surrounded bay of the island, which the sailors of that day called Ojaihi. It was good to partake of the ripe fruits, the fresh pork, potatoes, and yams which the natives, the women for the most part, brought aboard in such abundance, to have plenty of fresh water once more, and to see green hills and valleys instead of the endless expanse of blue. The island was always talked of by the few who had visited it as a veritable sailor's paradise. William Tuttle confessed to Michael, "I am anxious to be gone from here, lest I should begin to wish to stay forever. These smiling women, the smiling waters, and the smiling green of the hills seem to soak all the salt out of a man's bones." It was rumored that more than one ship's crew had thought that they were making friends with these supple-limbed, pleasant-faced inhabitants, and had in the end been murdered for the plunder of their vessel. The stay of the Jocasta was, however, so brief that no difficulties arose. She stood out from the harbor with a long line of canoes trailing in her wake and drifting down the wind, the call of a multitude of goodbyes in the melodious language of that pleasant isle. They touched again at a tiny outlying islet in this same group, having passed sufficiently close to see signals of distress flying upon the shore. 3 men who had drifted a long and terrible voyage eastward in the small boat of a British merchantman had here been finally washed up on the coast, and were perhaps scarcely more safe upon the land than they had been at sea. Their own ship, on a trading voyage for sandalwood to the Fijis, had been wrecked off the coast of Gilbert Islands, with all her crew taken safely to the boats, but with these 3 separated from their comrades and driven far across the Pacific. A ragged, scarecrow, half-starved trio they were when the Jocasta took them on board. "The natives have been friendly to us so far, since we had nothing of which they cared to rob us but—" Thus one of them, Leonard Dunn, told Michael in giving him account of the affair. There was a world of meaning in that "but." all the unlovely legends of the things of which these soft-voiced savages were capable. Not until the tiny island was nearly 1,000 miles astern did this knotted old Scotchman, who had followed the sea until he had memory of nothing else, permit himself a grim joke over how near they had possibly come to gracing the feast of some savage island king. "I've seen much," he declared in his hard Scotch burr, "and suffered a many things, but there's one end I could never abide, the thought of fetching up at last in the hands of cannibals." He was a valuable addition to the crew, for he knew these seas and the long stretch of reefs and islands off the shores of Asia, which were strange to everyone else on board. It was he who piloted them into their next port, that of Manila, where the Jocasta lay at anchor before a walled Spanish town built on the mudflats under soft green tropically wooded hills, and where Michael went ashore to exchange silver dollars for hemp. "It is pleasant to treat with white men again," Michael declared, although the bargain concluded with the bright-eyed, gesticulating Spanish merchant had been a complicated and hard-driven one. It was good, however, to see the straw-roofed sampans scuttling about the ship like water beetles, bringing aboard the first of their cargo of the Orient. This lading accomplished, they were ready to set their course across the China Sea. They had voyaged so far across great empty reaches of ocean where the way was all their own. Adventures they had had of all sorts, with storms and reefs and adverse currents, but at least there was no one to dispute their passage. Now they were once more approaching known harbors and long-established markets, and were, as a consequence, coming into dangers of another sort. "Wherever you have old trade routes, where there is coming and going over courses long laid down, there you will always have pirates," the Scotchman Dunn observed to Michael and the captain. "They swarm about these teeming harbors as rats swarm about a granary. The West Indies have their buccaneers, and the Mediterranean its Barbary corsairs, and we all know they are savage and cruel, but they are as babes to these Chinese cutthroats." "It is only what we must look for," Captain Douglas said. "We will keep good lookout for this last hazard of our voyage." The crossing of the China Sea was marked by nothing extraordinary. There was a superabundance of wind which drove them swiftly upon their course, even though it carried away a royal and a topgallant sail. To Michael it was one of the great moments of the whole cruise when they saw, late one afternoon, a flat shore stretching unbroken for miles to north and south, save only where a small, slow-moving river wandered through a maze of little islands and dropped lazily into the sea. Captain Douglas, marking their position on the chart, declared that, given fair weather, they were within only one more day's sail of Macao, at the entrance to the far-sought port of Canton. They swung about to skirt the coast northward, but now the wind fell almost completely, so that they beat back and forth all night, making little progress in the faintly stirring airs. When Michael came on deck before dawn, he found that they were in even worse case, for a heavy fog hung everywhere, obscuring both land and water, through which the Jocasta, jerking and dipping in a choppy swell, every sail and halyard dripping, was fumbling her way blindfold. "I do not like this," declared Charles Brigham, whom Michael relieved. "The fog and the uneasy sea are bad enough, but I have the disagreeable feeling somehow that we are not alone. Listen, do you hear anything?" Michael stood by the rail, straining his ears to make out whether he did indeed hear unwonted sounds or not. "It seems as though there were a whine and creak of blocks or great oars," he said finally, "but I cannot even make out from which direction it comes." "It comes from all directions," Charles Brigham declared ominously. "If there is one vessel near us, there are a dozen, though there is no means of knowing what sort of craft they may be." We will soon discover that, however, for unless I mistake me greatly, we are very shortly to have wind. Until it comes, I feel like a person who gropes his way about a dark room and hears rats that squeal and scuttle in the wall. He was right in his forecast of the weather. The wind was presently upon them with a swoop and a bellow, casting the fog aside and showing all too plainly into what company they had fallen. 50 of junks dotted the sea all about them, high-sided, rounded, rigged with the big, clumsy, matted sails, held widespread by battens of bamboo, and steered with huge creaking rudders. The wind was flinging them about like straws, so that they tossed and wallowed, and could pursue no determined course. Each had a big round eye painted on her bow, and every one of these great eyes seemed to roll and goggle helplessly as the clumsy vessel strove like one to round to in the same direction. There was no mistaking the fact that they were all attempting to close in upon the Jocasta. Captain Douglas came hurrying on the deck to issue a hail of orders. Spreading every sail which she could carry without capsizing, the American ship lay over to the wind and went cutting through the water. To outsail these darkly threatening craft was easier for the moment than to stop and give battle. Slowly they drew behind in spite of all their efforts at pursuit. On one which attempted too boldly to follow the Jocasta's course, the great matting sail carried away and went streaming out from the mast like an umbrella turned inside out by the high wind. "We have outdone them," cried Michael exultingly, looking back, but on the instant the lookout forward sang out, "Sail ho on the weather bow!" The last wreath of fog had hidden this single outlying junk, larger than any of the rest of the fleet. It came bearing down, whether by accident or design, square across their bows. Captain Douglas swung the Jocasta off her course, but to no purpose. Wind and driving waves were too great a force and were carrying the two vessels to unavoidable collision. The captain ordered his men to their battle stations, directed that the ship be cleared and weapons dealt out. Michael, as he ran forward, glanced for an instant over the side to survey the approaching junk. She was not only bigger but better built than her companions, so that his eye half unconsciously took in details of her carved teakwood rail and ornamented bow. There was, however, no doubt of her calling. She needed to fly no Chinese version of the Jolly Roger to prove what she was. 3 men were at the great sweep of a rudder. The others were crowded along the gunwale. A single sight of those half-naked bodies glistening wet from the fog, the upturned diabolical yellow faces, the long knives ready, and the heavy broad-bladed swords could indicate but one thing. The Scotchman, done examining the priming of a musket, spoke at Michael's elbow. "There is a pirate crew with but one choice before them. It's either board us or drown." A second later, a shudder and a smashing jar told that the Jocasta and the junk had crashed together. End of Chapter 10. Read by Christine Rucker, September 7th, 2025, Westford, Massachusetts.